that Solomon was a famous farmer because he had 700 combines.
Other way around.
Or what?
700 wives and 300 combines.
But when he was telling
It was an old farmer's joke. And
the people at they didn't get it. It was very funny.
And I'd heard
Because
it.
I laughed out loud. Nobody else did.
I'd heard it was 300 cucumbers.
No, 300 combines.
Well, good evening, everybody. It's good to see you. And whether you're in person or online, glad you're here. If you're online, feel free to turn your camera on. And if you don't want to, well, you can do that too. It's just entirely up to you. We are in 1 Kings chapter 3 tonight with a deviation over to 2 Chronicles chapter 1. We'll ping pong back and forth a little bit. The first thing we need to do tonight is kind of what we left off doing last week, and that's marry off Solomon. Now, there's a couple of interesting things about this. It's notable that in 1 Kings chapter 3, Solomon made a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. And the English Standard expresses it that way because it appears that's the character of probably most of Solomon's marriages, alliances, business, political. There was almost always, even today, amongst royalty, there's almost always a political element or some kind of a financial element to a marriage relationship, whereas we tend to think of marriage relationships primarily as a love match. In most of the world, though, it doesn't even reach to the realms of royalty. Much of the world, marriages are arranged between families, between parents, not between the people actually getting married to each other. The interesting thing about that is that divorce rates in cultures where marriages are arranged by parents or by a matchmaker, something like that, they're not statistically significantly different than they are here. The culture causes them to work. People work at it. And a little bit like Tevye and Golda and Fiddler on the Roof, they learned to love one another. Well, here, Solomon marries an Egyptian princess. Purpose? There's a political or an economic or both components to this marriage. Now, before we go any farther, take your Bible and flip over to, this time, to 2 Chronicles and look at 2 Chronicles about chapter, let me find the proper chapter, about chapter 10. And notice something after Solomon's death. In 2 Chronicles chapter 10, Rehoboam goes to Shechem. Israel comes to Shechem to make him king. Rehoboam becomes king. And as we proceed down through here, we learn that Rehoboam was 41 years old when he became king. Now, how long did Solomon reign? 40 years, just like David, just like Saul before him. 40, 40, and 40. It's easy to remember. The first three kings united Israel 120 years because they all reigned 40 years apiece. But what does that tell us about Solomon's marriage relationships? Here he is king, about to build the temple. He marries the Egyptian princess. She is not Rehoboam's mother. In fact, apparently Solomon was married before he became king, because Rehoboam, when he becomes king, is older than the number of years Solomon reigned. Not by a whole lot, but by enough. So apparently somewhere back there in Solomon's early life, there was a nice Jewish girl that he married and had a son named Rehoboam with. But she may have been the first. She certainly wasn't the last, was she? So we pick up in 1 Kings chapter 3, Solomon marries Pharaoh's daughter for political, economic purposes, whichever, both, one or the other, doesn't matter. And notice at this point, now he's ready to move forward as a builder. Now, this marriage to an Egyptian is not a violation of the law. There were people that the Hebrews were forbidden to marry. Egyptians were not in that category. This was permitted. Now, we have no record additionally that this is one of the wives who turned Solomon's heart away from God. You flip over to chapter 1, verses 1 through 8, and we read of Solomon that his many wives turned him away from God. There's nothing here for or against her in that respect. There's nothing said about her religion. At this point in his early life, early reign, what do we read about Solomon? His spiritual character. He's very zealous, very committed to serve God. And his spiritual condition. Look at the condition of himself and the kingdom in verses 2 and 3, 1 Kings chapter 3. You pick up here and it says the people were sacrificing at the high places. However, because no house had yet been built for the name of the Lord, Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of David his father. Only he sacrificed and made offerings at the high places. Well, what do we associate with the high places? Or what do we associate the high places with? Idolatry. And yet, the sacrificing at the high places in this context of both Solomon and the people does not come in a context of idolatry, but in a context of offering sacrifices evidently to the Lord in the high places. Notice what the writer says at verse 2, there was no temple yet. Well, there was a tabernacle, wasn't there? But apparently, either the tabernacle was not being utilized as it had been and was supposed to be, or maybe the sacrifices in the high place were beyond or in addition to or alongside of sacrifices in the tabernacle. We really don't know. Regardless of which it is, what's going on here seems to fall into the category that Paul described to the Athenians in Acts chapter 17 when he said the times of ignorance God overlooked. During this ancient time, there were some things that did not have God's seal of approval on them, which he endured, shall we say. He tolerated. Doesn't mean he approved, but he tolerated. And this may fall into that category. We don't know for sure because nothing is ever stated explicitly on the subject. We find in verse 3, Solomon loved the Lord. He followed David's example at this point in his early mature life, his early reign. The offerings at the high places seems to have been a compromise that God accepted, that God tolerated. You look at verse 4, at Gibeon, the king went there to sacrifice. That was the great high place. Well, there's a lot of history there. At various times, prophets and priests had been there. And for that great high place, Solomon used to offer 1,000 sacrifices on that altar. That's got to be time consuming and expensive, even for a king at this point. Now, Solomon is nowhere near as wealthy as he's going to become. But what you have here is a tremendous sacrifice from a sincere heart.
Did he offer them all at once, or was it over a period?
Was it all at once or over a period of time? I don't know. It says he used to offer, that was the great place where he used to offer 1,000 burnt offerings at that time. So was this a one-time offering? Was this an annual thing? I don't know. Was it cumulative? It doesn't seem to be from the wording of it, but regardless, it's an enormous offering. Mike?
We know historically, when Joshua brought him into the land, where the high place worship started, who started it, how it got started.
How did the Israelites get started worshiping in the high places from the time of Joshua bringing the people into the land? There is, to my knowledge, there's not a definitive statement that says, okay, at this point they started worshiping God in the high places. Did they adapt this from Canaanite practice? It kind of looks that way because that certainly is what they did. We know that at various times they dabbled in Canaanite idolatry, and over the period of the kings, it's going to get a whole lot worse before it gets better. How did this come about? We really don't have any explicit details except that there was no temple at that point. Now, another thought, another question that we might just pose here. Were all sacrifices offered in the tabernacle or the temple? Were they all supposed to be offered at the tabernacle or the temple? There was a daily offering in the tabernacle and in the temple, the morning and evening oblation, sacrifice in the morning and sacrifice in the evening, lamb or ram both times, every day. But, and there was the Day of Atonement offering, there were the offerings for Passover and so forth. Now the Passover offering, that could not have been in the temple or in the tabernacle, because where was that to be done? Those were done in homes. When God sent Israel into the promised land, gave them that territory, one of the things he did was he scattered 48 cities of Levites throughout all of the other tribal territories. For what purpose?
Priesthood.
Okay, so that teaching and learning and, shall we say, the service of the priests would be accessible to all of the other tribes, to all the people. They would not have to go to Jerusalem to talk to a priest. They would not have to go to Jerusalem to talk to a Levite. They would not, in the days of the judges, they wouldn't have to track down the tabernacle where it was at Ramoth Gilead or at Gibeon, or the various places that it was at different times. There were Levites scattered throughout the population. There were priests scattered throughout the population. When a sin offering was offered, did they have to bring it to the tabernacle or the temple? When a free will offering was offered, did they have to bring it to the tabernacle or the temple? They had to bring it to the priest. But there were priests basically everywhere. We labor sometimes under the image that the temple or the tabernacle before it were the only places that Jews gathered for worship. And that was not the case ever. Now that would have been the highlight, the high point of a Jew's life, to be in the temple for worship. In the temple on the high holy days or whatnot. You flip over to Luke chapter 2, and what do you find was the annual custom for Mary, Joseph, and their family? They came all the way from Nazareth up to Jerusalem for the Passover, for the high holy days. They made an annual pilgrimage, and that was a pretty good little walk, a couple of days journey each way. But that was the exception, not the rule. They didn't do that every week. Go ahead, Mike.
Didn't believe it's Samuel,
Mm-hmm.
who had to rebuke Saul because he didn't want to carry and wait for a sacrifice.
Yeah.
He did it himself, and he got rebuked. He clearly
There you
wasn't in
go.
the temple.
There you go. In the days of, good point, in the days of Saul and Samuel, when Saul was preparing to go out to war, he didn't wait for Samuel to arrive and offer the sacrifice. He offered sacrifice on his own in 1 Samuel chapter 13. And he clearly was not in the location of the tabernacle. Of course, that got him in trouble with God. And then he compounded it in chapter 15 with the business of the Amalekites.
Brother Robert,
But
so
here's,
it changed? So, I mean, you said first they was, the Levites were scattered throughout the tribe, so they didn't have to go to Jerusalem, then it changed?
well, no, it didn't change in that respect. But what we find is that as they settle in, what do they seem to do? They kind of seem to begin to adopt some of the practices of the people in the name of worshiping God. That doesn't say that they worshiped idols in the high places at this point. Now we'll get down to the latter days of both kingdoms, and we'll find that they did that and more. Brought it right into the town square in Jerusalem at one point. But here, the high places seemed to be the locations that seemed natural and dare we say, spiritual in the minds of the people. In their minds, in their thinking, the logical places for this. Now, the fact that perhaps it seemed that way to them, does that make it a good thing? No. Does that make it a right thing? No. Did God accept that? It seems that he did for the time being. But why did Saul go to Gibeon to offer sacrifices? Go back to verse 3. No temple yet. Once the temple is built, that seems to be seems to change. So at verse 5 now we have the incident from verse 5 to verse 15 where God speaks to Solomon. Now this is the first of 3 times that God is going to speak to Solomon directly, appear to Solomon directly and speak to him. The first time, God basically gives him a blank check. Ask whatever you want and I'll do it for you. Boy, is there temptation in that? Is there a testing of this man's character in that kind of an offering? In Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night. Ask what I shall give you. Boy, that's an open-ended offer. Look at Solomon's response. Now, there's a great deal of humility in Solomon as a young ruler. It appears that it doesn't stay that way for long. But right here, you were good to my father David. You blessed him because of his faithfulness. I can't, basically says, I don't even begin to measure up to his understanding and his skill and his ability. I'm like a little child. Now, he's not a little child. He's at least in his early 20s at this point. But I'm young. I'm relatively speaking inexperienced. Now, think about this. David has, at least in his last years, David has schooled Solomon to rule. He has prepared him, even if it was just the last few weeks or months of his life. So he's had some good counsel, some good direction. He's also had some very specific instructions about how to begin his reign and things that he needs to do. And he's taken care of those. So he's already made some hard choices, some hard decisions. He's gotten his feet under him, dealt with the business with Adonijah, trying to usurp the throne. And Adonijah was a lot older and in some ways a lot more experienced, but Solomon passes through that safely and deals with that, gets Joab out of the way and Abiathar and so forth. So now God says, you ask and I'll give. And what does Solomon ask for? Give me discernment, give me wisdom. Now, think about what that implies about his perspective on his role in the kingdom. Does he need money? No. The things that he's got in mind to do at this point, to carry out his father's instructions, to build a house for the Lord, to enlarge David's palace, build himself a house and so forth. He's got the resources to do that. David has provided that. The kingdom is basically at peace at this point. He doesn't have to maintain a big standing army. He has not yet really begun to embark on his trade ventures, and so he doesn't have a lot of expense or risk there yet. He will eventually, and that will come back to him many times over. His investment in that, he'll become quite wealthy with God's help. So from a secular, political, just human ego point of view, God says, ask what you want. And Solomon actually seems to show a lot of a lot of native wisdom here in looking at himself and basically saying, I don't need money. I don't need power. I've got all of this. What I need is perspective. What I need is wisdom. What I need is your help to rule this people. So give me wisdom, give me discernment, give me an understanding heart. And God's response, good choice. You picked the winning door, so to speak. And because you picked the right prize, I'm going to give you all the other, you get the grand prize. I'm going to give you everything else as well. I'll not only give you more wisdom than anybody before or since. In fact, the wording here basically says Solomon was about to become the wisest man ever to live before or since, next to Jesus himself. And you don't just get door number one, you get door number two and door number three as well. You get riches and power and all these other things. And from a historic point of view, God is going to expand the boundaries of Solomon's rule even beyond David's. Now, just a little side note, our millennialist friends in the various denominations and a few of them in the church build their case for the Lord to come and reign for 1,000 years from Jerusalem on an earthly throne. They try to build that case on the purported fact that God has never completely fulfilled the promise, the land promise to Israel. Because if you look at the boundaries that God outlined to Moses, and then you look at the boundaries that the children of Israel actually conquered and occupied in the days of Joshua, guess what? God outlined more territory to Moses than the people conquered in Joshua's day. But number one, what does Joshua say in Joshua 23 and verse 14? Not one whit, not one bit of what God promised has failed to come to pass. The reason that the tribes did not receive all of the territory that they could have in Joshua's day, every single tribe that received a land inheritance, all 10 tribes and the 2 half tribes of Joseph, every single one of them stopped short in some degree of what they could have had. So it was on them, not on God. But number two, in the days of David expanded the boundaries of the kingdom beyond what God had promised to Moses, and Solomon then pushes beyond David. So this whole notion that somehow God has not fully kept the land promise, has not fully fulfilled it, that he still somehow owes Israel some dirt, that's a bunch of nonsense. Because biblically, number one, Joshua says God did not fail in any respect in his promise. And number two, eventually, in the days of David and Solomon, they not only controlled all of that, they controlled tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of acres or square miles more than what had initially been promised. So ask what you will. Give me wisdom, give me discernment, give me understanding. You got it? Plus. And the plus is that Solomon is going to become wealthy beyond imagination and powerful, all out of proportion, influential, all out of proportion to the territory that he actually rules. So that all of the rulers and the wise men of the East in that ancient day, they are just in awe of his wisdom. What does the Queen of Sheba say when she comes to see and to explore? The half has not been told. I heard and I didn't believe and I came to see, and good grief, it's not even, they didn't even tell half of the wisdom of Solomon. But this is the first of 3 times that God appears. First, to bless him, to offer him a blank check. The second time is going to come in chapter 9, verse 2 of 1 Kings. And the second time is a different circumstance. There, it's a warning to Solomon because his behavior is not measuring up to his wisdom. The third time comes just shortly after, in chapter 11 of 1 Kings, starting at verse 9, going down to the end of the chapter. And the third time God appears to him is an outright condemnation for his misbehavior. So he starts out good. I would hope that he straightened out and repented before he died. Nothing in the scripture says that he did. And he's conspicuously absent in Hebrews chapter 11 in the Hall of Fame of Faith over in the New Testament. I hope we'll see him. I would think he would be fascinating to talk to in eternity. I'm not going to hold my breath. That's between him and God. Now, concerning the sacrifice here at Gibeon, had this type of sacrifice not been acceptable at this point in time, is it reasonable that God would have come to Solomon in this kind of vision at this point to offer him blessing? Now, whether God approved it or whether God tolerated it, the one thing he did not do was reject it in this circumstance. Ask what I shall give you. That offer, if you think about it, is made to every human soul. Every one of us has the opportunity. God opens the treasury of heaven to every one of us if we'll accept it. Why do we lose the blessings God offers? We allow ourselves to be blinded by temptation. We take our eyes off the goal. We're blinded by the glamour as we perceive it of temptation. What is temptation? Temptation is poison and acid wrapped in tinfoil. It's pretty on the outside until you bite into it, and then it kills you. Candy, you say? Worse than candy. It's a poison pill. Well, so proceeding down through these verses, the gift is granted, plus everything else that he could have asked for, but did not. But look down to chapter 3 and verse 14, and notice here that like all blessings God offers, this one's conditional. If you will walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and my commandments as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days. How long did Solomon live? We know he reigned 40 years. He seems to have been roughly 20 or so. So let's just, for argument's sake, let's say somewhere between 18 and about 24 or 25 when he became king. Give ourselves a little bit of a range there. If he reigns for 40 years, Solomon dies at a younger age than David, because David was 70 when he died. If you walk in David's ways, I'll lengthen your days. Now, if Solomon's in his 60s when he dies, does that perhaps imply something about Solomon not walking in the Lord's ways? It might very well. All of this is given miraculously. Wisdom, power, prosperity. God offers this as a miracle. Now, the carrying out of much of it, the power, the prosperity, that's done through providential means. But the gift is associated with God's appearance to him. And so at verse 15, now we have more sacrifices, and he stands before the Ark of the Covenant and offers still more burnt offerings and peace offerings and so forth at this point. Chapter 3 starting at verse 16, going down to the end of the chapter, then gives us some demonstrations, some illustrations of Solomon's wisdom. Go ahead, Luann.
Before you go on,
Mm-hmm.
verse 15 bothers me because it says, he stood before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, offered up burnt offerings. That was only the high priest
Okay,
in the Holy of Holies, right?
okay. He stood before the ark of the Lord in Jerusalem. And the question is, the ark is supposed to reside in the most holy place in the tabernacle. Well, what would this imply then about where the tabernacle is at this point? It would be evidently in the environment of Jerusalem. Now, is Solomon literally in the presence looking at the Ark of the Covenant? I do not believe so, because the Ark of the Covenant was supposed to be hooded whenever it was moved, covered, and it was supposed to be isolated in the most holy place whenever the tabernacle is set up. This would seem to imply that the tabernacle is now present in Jerusalem, even though David's plan is to build a permanent structure, not a tent. And if the daily sacrifices and so forth are being offered, it's in operation. Now, to stand before the Ark of the Covenant, does that say Solomon is face to face with it? Not necessarily. The expression before, as it's used in the Old Testament, frequently means in front of or in the vicinity of, before the gates of the city. Well, how close do you have to be to the gates of the city? You don't have to be standing in the gatehouse to be before the gates of the city. Absalom, in the days that he was trying to undermine David, was probably literally in the gates of the city, before the gates of the city, as it says, literally right there where the wise men and the counselors would assemble. But we also find that figure of speech used to describe being in the vicinity of. That is, if Solomon is before the Ark of the Covenant, the Ark of the Lord, he's there where all the paraphernalia of the tabernacle are located, where the daily sacrifices are being offered. Does that mean he goes into the Holy of Holies? No. After all, Solomon is not offering the sacrifices with his own hands. Who does that? That would be the priests. Now, if he offers a sacrifice for himself, for his own sins, what does he have to do? He has to cut the sacrifice's throat, just like any other Jewish man, Hebrew man would. But even then, who's going to butcher it, basically, and offer it up? That's going to be the priest. So the statement in verse 15 that he awoke, behold, it was a dream, came to Jerusalem, stood before the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, and offered up burnt offerings and peace offerings, and made a feast for all his servants. That does not say that he went into the Holy of Holies. That would be an egregious violation of everything that Exodus through Deuteronomy had taught the children of Israel about how they interacted with God in that venue. In the presence of, he's there where the tabernacle is. And that does seem to indicate that the tabernacle, or at least some components of it, have been erected and put into use there in Jerusalem during this period of time. What was David's ambition? Before he could build the temple, what did he have to do? Well, he brought the ark, and the implication is everything associated with it, to Jerusalem. That's the business with Uzzah and the house of Obed-Edom. So all of this has been relocated to Jerusalem before Solomon ever becomes king.
Could it be possible the tabernacle is not set up?
Is it possible the tabernacle was not actually set up and in use?
They have the high places, so the tabernacle, I mean, I'm trying to, maybe I'm trying to.
Yeah. Because they are, you're right, they are sacrificing in the high places, and some of them, Gibeon is described as a great high place, or it's a big draw, a popular, I guess you would say, high place. Is it possible the tabernacle is not set up and in operation? I suppose you're asking kind of a what do you think question. I suppose it's possible, but that would sort of beg the question, then how do we come back and offer sacrifices before the ark if it's not? Because to offer sacrifices, what else would have to be there? The altar for the sacrifices to be offered on. And that would seem to suggest that everything's in place. Going on, the last half of the chapter is the illustration of Solomon's wisdom. The two women with the children, they're both women of poor character, shall we say. The English Standard is just very frank in verse 16. Two prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. You have to wonder if these women are practicing harlots. Harlotry is not something that is generally approved among God's people. That would tell us a little bit about the character of the people as a whole. Even in Israel, even in a theocracy, there's every strata of good and bad. And for these women to ply that trade, there got to be men that cooperate, men that support them to some degree. Go ahead, Benji.
Also, it may also show a picture whereas everyone has the right to stand before the king,
Yeah.
regardless of the background.
Yeah. On the one hand, you've got these women of shall we say, questionable moral character. But on the other hand, they seem to be citizens of the nation. They have the right to have their dispute judged by the king. Maybe it has percolated its way up through the lesser courts, we don't know. But regardless, their background does not speak well of them. Solomon, though, is willing to hear the case. I live in the same house with this woman. I gave birth to a child. She gave birth to a child 3 days after. There was nobody there with us. Her child died in the night. And so what did we do? She swapped children. And so when I rose in the morning, verse 21, my child was dead, except wasn't my child. And so we've had this squabble ever since. All right, how do we resolve this? Split the child. Give me chaff. Simple problem, simple solution. And if you think about it, one child is dead. The mother of the dead child has nothing to lose. But this exposes the mother, the real mother of the living child. She'd rather sacrifice that child in the sense of giving it up to a woman who would steal it so that it lives, than to see her child die as well. He reviews the case himself. Solomon gives judgment, divide the child. The true mother pleads, no, give it to her. The outcome at the end of the chapter is really the focus of all of this. All Israel heard of the judgment that he had rendered, and they stood in awe of the king because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him to do justice. Now let's think about that concept for just a minute. The wisdom of God was in him to do justice. In our legal system, what is the object of any legal proceeding in the American legal system, be it federal, state, local? The object is to administer justice. Now, we tend to think pretty much of one side of that equation, and that is punishment for wrongdoers. Flip over to Romans chapter 13, and Paul talks about Christians' responsibility before civil authorities, and he makes the point that civil authorities have a dual role there to punish the evildoer, but also to reward the righteous. how many nations in the history of humanity, how many rulers in the history of humanity stand out for that particular quality of rewarding righteousness? Can you name one? We see Solomon's wisdom demonstrated, but even Solomon doesn't live in our memory for rewarding righteousness per se, but simply for wisely administering justice. And they perceive that the justice of God, the wisdom of God, was in him to do justice. The wisdom of God to do justice would be what? Well, that would be absolutely fair, wouldn't it? Scrupulously fair. What individual going into any kind of legal or court proceeding wants absolutely fair, perfect justice? If I sue Rick for some perceived slight or wrongdoing, I take him to court. Of course, we know brother shouldn't take brother to court, but just for the sake of illustration, if I do that, what am I seeking? It may be revenge. It may be punitive damages. I may, Rick backed into my truck and put a tiny little scratch on it, and I want that tiny little scratch repaired, and I want him fined $1,000 in punitive damages just to punish him. Is that just? Or does that kind of smack of piling on in that case? We're not talking about an award for legitimate pain and suffering. We're talking about just rubbing salt in the wound because I got the upper hand if I win. On the other hand, if I am the accused in some kind of legal proceeding, do I want justice if I'm guilty? Oh, have mercy, no. What do I want? I either want a miscarriage of justice that lets me go free. Can we say, no bail for shoplifters in 21st century America? Or if not a miscarriage of justice, I just want mercy. Don't give me what I deserve. If you think about it from that standpoint, when the people of Israel watch Solomon and they see that the wisdom of God is in him for justice, it's going to become a very intimidating thing to bring a matter to the king for judgment unless you are absolutely innocent or absolutely sure that your case is airtight. It's going to be a powerful incentive to settle things before they ever get to that level. And if you think about it, go back to the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and as Moses lays out the practical applications of the law, what were the children of Israel supposed to do in the matter of most of their, shall we say, more minor conflicts and disputes amongst themselves in the first place? They were really supposed to work this out themselves. I accidentally killed your ox. I didn't mean to. I dropped a rock on his head accidentally and killed your ox. I owe you an ox plus. All right, shell it out. On the other hand, what do people typically do? I want to get somebody on my side so that I get the better end of this deal. When you're faced with the prospect of perfect justice instead of an advantage, it takes away a lot of the incentive to try to gain that extra advantage over someone. So Solomon demonstrates wisdom that leaves the people in awe because they recognize that its source is God. Go ahead, Mike.
They can kind of approach him in a similar fashion to how it would feel approaching Jehovah himself.
It might well be.
They're saying this is God's wisdom in this man. It's like me going to Jehovah with this kind of stuff, and I'm not real confident with doing this.
You may have a good point there. As they perceive the wisdom of God in Solomon, it may become very intimidating to take a matter to the king, because in a sense, since God is with him, you're approaching God himself for this. Who else in Israel might have been held on that same level of esteem? Maybe the high priest. And that would be pretty intimidating in that respect. So lots of people look back at this. We read over this in the 21st century. Oh, it's easy. 2020 hindsight. It was easy for him to figure this out, easy for him to do this. But was it? After all, if both women agree, what hangs in the balance? An innocent child's life. The speed, the swiftness, the firmness, and the compassion of Solomon in this instance are not common to ordinary people. They're not normal for ordinary folks. They're a reflection of God's presence in him. So, chapter 4 then in 1 Kings takes us into the administration of Solomon's kingdom and the practical aspects of this. If you have a copy of Crockett, this will put us over here. Actually, it jumps forward in Crockett into 1 Kings chapter 5. This is a section that is not exactly paralleled in 2 Chronicles. But in chapter 4 in 1 Kings, we have details of Solomon's administration down through about verse 19. The various officials, Zadok is the high priest, is the priest, and Elihoreph and Ahijah, the sons of Shisha, are secretaries, and so on and so forth. Various names of individuals given here. What you have are basically the princes of Israel, the high-ranking men in verses 1 through 6, the chief ministers, and the extent of the kingdom. Now pick up at verse 7. Now, I mentioned, just look over these names briefly. Things changed when Solomon became king. It says Zadok was the priest. Well, who had been the priest up to this point during David's reign? That's Abiathar. And Solomon has taken Abiathar out of the way. He didn't kill him. He could have, but he simply basically exiled him home, took him out of the high priest role because of his support of Adonijah. And that was with David's blessing, David's instruction at that point. That's the exception to the rule. How does a man normally become high priest?
Birth.
Death of the
Well,
current high
the
priest.
previous high priest has to die. Abiathar didn't die, but he was removed for basically for his treason. So you have an exceptional circumstance here, but Zadok is the high priest, and the others are secretaries and the recorder, and the Jehoiada, Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, is the chief of staff of the military, the commander of the armies, and so forth. Abishar was in charge of the palace, and Adoniram in charge of the forced labor. That doesn't speak necessarily well of Solomon, does it? But pick up at verse 7, and now you get a little taste of what it was like to live in Solomon's kingdom. You've got 12 officers appointed, 12 prominent men representing the 12 tribes, representing really 12 regions, one for each month. 2 of them are Solomon's sons-in-law, verses 11 and 15, which tells us how far down the road we are into his rulership and how early he must have started having children, because he's got married daughters at this point. They may be quite young, but still the men would be grown men. And these men are charged with what?
and food for the king and his household.
Their job is within their territory, which the territorial boundaries don't seem to exactly mirror the territory of the tribe, but generally speaking, these men are to gather up enough from each territory to support the king and all the people at court and all of his shall we say, hired help for a month every year. This is taxation. This is an imposition of duties, basically, scattered across the nation. Jump back to 1 Samuel chapters 8 and 9 for a minute. What did Samuel warn the people about when they said, give us a king? You haven't been paying any taxes, folks. You won't pay taxes now? Are you sure this is a good deal? Boy, Solomon is going to increase and increase and increase the load. At this point, it doesn't seem to be too onerous. Each region, each part of the country, one time in the year, they're storing up for their turn to support the king. You know, if you're really blessed and lucky, maybe your time comes in the midsummer when the harvest is coming in and you've got plenty, unless there's a drought. Or in the fall when the rest of the harvest is coming in. But, you know, if your time to support the king comes in the dead of winter, you may have to dip into what you've got stored up for you and yours in order to provide your share for the king. And the guy in charge of collecting it, I wouldn't put him on a par with the sheriff of Nottingham, but he may not be too sympathetic to your problems when he's got to answer to the king himself. So 12 officers, one for each month, 2 sons-in-law to Solomon in this, a huge number of people. Look down at verse 20 here. Judah and Israel were as many as the sand by the sea. They ate and drank and were happy. What had God promised Abraham? Genesis 12. I will make your offspring like the sand on the seashore. I will give you a lot of folks as descendants. Well, here they are. Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines and to the border of Egypt. Now let's think about this for a minute. I am no cartographer, but if this is the Mediterranean coast, we've got Mount Carmel here, and this runs down all the way to North Africa. You've got the territory of the Philistines that would run roughly along the Mediterranean coast here. You have the Sea of Galilee right about here. It's shaped a little bit like a lopsided kite, but the River Jordan that feeds into it from the Lebanon and Anti-Lebanon mountains up here, down to the Dead Sea, down here. Jerusalem would be approximately here. The Euphrates River is where? The Euphrates is way over here, hundreds of miles away, across the desert.
Near Babylon.
Well, yeah, it leads down to Babylon.
Modern day Iraq.
Well, yeah. Solomon rules all of this territory from the mountains in the north, all the way down here to Egypt, which is down below the whiteboard, including the Philistines on the Mediterranean coast, all the way from the Negev across into what we would call Arabia and way over into modern day Iran and Iraq. That's a whole lot more territory than God ever promised in Moses' day. Now, does that mean that he ran out of all that territory, all of the other peoples that were there? No. The Edomites are still down there in Mount Seir, and the Moabites and the Ammonites, some of their descendants are still there. Still some Philistines over here on the coast. Syrians and Assyrians in the north. But they're tributaries or they're allies to Solomon. At this point, they're not, for the most part, rivals or opponents. He rules a tremendous territory. Now, take a moment and flip over to 2 Chronicles chapter 9 for just a minute. In 2 Chronicles chapter 9, I I want you to notice something down here. Pick up at verse 22 and read with me down to verse 28, really. 2 Chronicles 9, starting at 22. Thus, King Solomon excelled all the kings of the earth in riches and wisdom. Now we're moving forward a little bit chronologically from 1 Kings 4 at this point. We'll come back to 1 Kings 4 in a minute. So Solomon at this point has already acquired immense wealth. All the kings of the earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put into his mind. Every one of them brought his present, articles of silver, of gold, garments, myrrh, spices, horses, mules, so much year by year. And Solomon had 4,000 stalls for horses and chariots, 12,000 horsemen whom he stationed in the chariot cities and with the king in Jerusalem. Notice verse 26. And he reigned over all the kings from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines and to the border of Egypt. And then it goes on in verse 27, the king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stone. He made cedar as plentiful as the sycamore of the Shephelah, and the horses were imported for Solomon from Egypt and from all lands. But go back to verse 26. He ruled everything from Euphrates to the land of the Philistines, including the kings. Why does that matter? Because that completely discredits, that simple statement completely discredits the dispensationalists, the millennialists that are the backbone of most of Protestant and some of Catholic theology in the 21st century. It completely discredits the idea that somehow Jesus has to come back and reign on an earthly throne and conquer all of this land because God never fulfilled his promise. Solomon reigned all of it and then some, reigned over all of it and then some. And the scriptures say so. Now, the amount back here in 1 Kings chapter 4 at verse 22, Solomon's provision for one day was 30 cores of flour, 60 cores of meal, 10 fat oxen, 20 pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep, besides deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fattened fowl.
One day.
That's what it says. Now, if you figure, for argument's sake, let's figure 2 pounds of bread and 1.5 pounds of meat per day per person. How many people is that they're feeding every day? That's about 14,000 people a day. That is one honking big commissary that Solomon's officers have to keep supplied every day of the year. But you go on in verses 24 and 25, and here's the money quote, as they would say in Jerry Maguire, show me the money. Here it is. They had peace. Judah and Israel lived in safety from Dan to Beersheba, every man under his vine and under his tree all the days of Solomon. Kept a large standing cavalry to maintain peace. But go back to Deuteronomy chapter 17. What did Moses warn the people about long before they ever had kings or asked for kings? The day that you have a king, he's going to want a cavalry. And he's going to impress your kids to serve him. He's going to press them into service for that. So at the last part, the last paragraph of chapter 4, now here is the surpassing wisdom of Solomon. God gave Solomon wisdom, understanding beyond measure, the breadth of mind like the sand of the seashore, so that Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people of the East. He was wiser. Notice how he's described here. He was wiser than all other men, wiser than Ethan the Ezrahite and Heman, Calcol, and Darda, the sons of Mahal. His fame was in all the surrounding nations. He also spoke 3,000 proverbs. What's a proverb?
Wise saying.
I'm glad you put it that way. We typically say, well, that's a pithy saying. It's something interesting. It sticks with you, but it's more than that. It's a wise saying. It's a statement of wisdom. Solomon spoke 3,000 proverbs. His songs were 1,005. We don't have all of them. We have some of them. Have very few of his songs. A couple of them in the Psalms. Spoke of trees, from the cedar that is in Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the wall. He spoke also of beasts, birds, reptiles, fish. People of all nations came to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and all the kings of the earth had heard of his wisdom. Solomon understood zoology and botany on a level that others of that day, and you think about this, if you have farming roots, your parents or your grandparents or your great-grandparents grew up on a farm, lived on a farm, how much more did they understand of animal husbandry and animal behavior and characteristics of animals and plants and biology? How much more did they understand than you do, most likely? How many more plants could they readily identify just by looking at them? And you have no idea. I don't know if that's a weed or a flower. Solomon surpasses all of that by orders of magnitude. Solomon arguably knew and understood characteristics of the natural world that naturalists and scientists and students of the natural world today don't yet understand, because God gave him wisdom. God provided him everything he could need. Excessive wisdom, largeness of heart, wisdom beyond all the wise men of that ancient time. Much of Solomon's writing is lost to us. But now we come to chapter 5, and chapters 5, 6, and 7 give us the construction of the temple. And you have the parallel to that over in 2 Chronicles, and more detail there in 2 Chronicles than we have here. 2 Chronicles starting in chapter 2. First thing that we notice here is his arrangements with Hiram, or as Chronicles calls him, Huram, the king of Tyre. Well, this goes back to David's day. How far back does this go? I don't know. Was Hiram a tributary king? Maybe. But he had an alliance with David, and more than that, they were friends. What does that seem to imply then about Hiram's relationship with God? Jump forward in history less than 100 years, 150 years, and who after Solomon's death is going to be on the throne of Israel about 125 years down the road? I'll give you a hint. He's going to marry a Sidonian princess. And she is going to be nothing but bad for his relationship with God. His name is Ahab, and her name is Jezebel. So less than 200 years later, the influence of the Sidonians, and Tyre and Sidon are practically twin cities. Where'd my marker go? They're on the Mediterranean coast, basically right about here and right about here, just north of Mount Carmel. And the influence of these Phoenician peoples, they're related to the Philistines, over a span of roughly 100 years is going to go from friendship, loyalty, helpfulness, appreciation, and arguably perhaps even honor for the God of Israel to full-bore corruption of Israelite morals and religion, and the importation of idol worship in the form of Baalim and Asherah. So Solomon and Hiram, chapter 5, Hiram had always loved David. Solomon sent word, all right, you loved my father, you were friends with my father. You know that his plan, his desire to build a temple, a house for the Lord, was thwarted by God. God didn't permit that, but he made agreements with you. Now it's time for us to renew those agreements and carry this out. God has given me rest on every side. No adversaries, no opposition, nothing to stand in my way. And the other side of that coin, Hiram wants to maintain friendly relations with Solomon. Why? Well, just back up to the end of chapter 4. Man, this guy, number one, he has a history with Solomon's daddy. They were good friends, apparently. But number two, this young fellow Solomon, he's a rising star. And who doesn't want to be on the side of a rising star when he's rising with God on his side? God is blessing Solomon materially. You line up with Solomon, what's that going to do to your treasury? If Solomon's getting fabulously rich, if you're on Solomon's side and you're doing business with him, well, you're probably going to profit anyway. And that's exactly how it turns out for Hiram. Now, at this point, they begin to carry out these plans. I intend to build a house for the name of the Lord my God, just as as the Lord said to David, my father, your son will do this. Now, therefore, verse 6, 1 Kings chapter 5. Command that cedars of Lebanon be cut for me, and my servants will join your servants, and I will pay you for your servants such wages as you said. For you know that there's no one among us who knows how to cut timber like the Sidonians. Now, a couple of interesting things here. Where are the cedars of Lebanon? There are no cedars of Lebanon anymore. There are no dramatically forested places in that region anymore. You get into the upper reaches, the higher elevations of the Lebanon and anti-Lebanon mountains up here. And yes, there is there are trees and there is some level of forestation, but nothing on the order of what was there in that day. There's no lumber industry in that part of the world to speak of. Whatever wood the people find, what do they tend to do with it? It's still a third world country now. Whatever wood people can drag up now is largely firewood. It's kind of like Haiti. You know, the Haiti end of the island suffers constant erosion and mudslides and so forth because there's no ground cover, no trees to hold the soil in place and so forth. Well, that's kind of the condition that exists there now. But what does this tell us about the natural conditions of that ancient day? It was a different place, a different world in a sense. We look at the region of modern day Palestine, and what kind of territory do we see? What does it look like to us? Arid, dusty. It looks like the American desert Southwest. It looks like southern New Mexico or parts of Arizona to our eyes. Now, in places where the modern Israelis have purified seawater and piped it in to irrigate, what happens there? Oh, the land blooms and it's green and fertile. But without that water, it's a desert basically. Now, even deserts have their ecosystems and their plant and animal life. It's not like it's just acre after acre after acre of sand. But here's the point. What we see in that part of the world in the 21st century is not what the spies saw when Moses sent them in Numbers chapter 13 to spy out the land. Remember what they brought back? They brought back a cluster or a branch from a grapevine that required 2 men to carry it. In ancient days, grapes grown in the Sorek Valley were the most prized grapes of the ancient world. The Sorek Valley grapes were acclaimed in the ancient world as the sweetest, richest, best grapes you could get. And wine or grape juice made from that was the primo stuff. The Sorek Valley is not known for its grapes much anymore. The mountains of Lebanon are not known for their timber industry. You know, there's a bad old joke about a little short guy that shows up in the Pacific Northwest and applies for a job as a logger, and the foreman asks him, "Where have you worked before?" "Well, I used to cut timber in the Sahara forest." And he says, "Well, that's nothing but a desert." And he says, "Yeah, it is now." Well, that's kind of the deal with the cedars of Lebanon. They were the forest cover there was big enough, lush enough in those days that Hiram could provide construction-sized timbers, not just for the temple, but for Solomon's palace and David's palace before that. The trees were big enough that they had to float them down the coast and then carry them inland, overland, to get them to Jerusalem. And you don't find that kind of material there anymore. Notice also the arrangement that Solomon makes. I'll send workers, you gather workers, I'll pay their wages, whatever price you set. He doesn't bargain about this. He's not trying to get the cheapest labor. Now, I know it's about time for us to take a break, but just think about this in terms of the church. We want to be good stewards of what the Lord provides, don't we? But too often, is it not truly the case that we think of good stewardship as being defined by the absolute lowest bid on something? Solomon was not short-sighted when it came to the quality of construction and the quality of workmanship that he wanted for the temple. Now, I'm not saying we need to build cathedrals to stand for the ages. In fact, don't ever hire an architect to build a church building, because he only hears two things. He hears unlimited budget and cathedral to last into eternity. Hire a builder that knows how to build and then get some plans. That's just my 2 cents worth on that subject. But Solomon did not even try to cut corners here. Okay, questions, comments, thoughts? We'll come back and build the temple after the break. All right, we'll stop here and take about a 15-minute break. We'll be back at it's 7:18. We'll be back at about 7:33. Well, let's build a temple. So, 1 Kings chapter 5 and 2 Chronicles chapter 2, preparations for the building of the temple. We talked about Hiram and the relationship there, and how that Solomon was willing to pay what it cost, basically. And you look at what he had, he certainly had the resources at his disposal for this. But notice in chapter 5 and verse 13, Solomon drafted forced labor from all Israel, 30,000 men, and he sent them to Lebanon in shifts, 10,000 men at a time, 10,000 men a month. They'd be a month in Lebanon and 2 months at home. Forced labor. Now, they were not slaves. Solomon would practice slavery later on and enslaving neighboring peoples and Canaanite peoples. His own people were not slaves. Think of them more as draftees.
New King James uses the word labor force. It doesn't say forced labor.
Yeah.
It says labor force. So,
But when we get down to the time of Rehoboam, That's one of the things that's brought up as an objection, is that some of these people did not have evidently much or any say in the matter. They were drafted.
Welcome to your new job.
Basically, yes, welcome to your new job, now get to work, that sort of thing. Now, you have Adoniram put in charge of the draft, and Solomon has 70,000 bearers and 80,000 stone cutters and 3,300 officers over the work and so forth. So there is a huge workforce brought into this. Now, flip over to 2 Chronicles chapter 2 for a minute and notice at verses 13 and 14, Hiram puts into this skilled workmen that Solomon does not possess. And there's a reason for this that we don't sometimes think about. You pick up at 2 Chronicles chapter 2 and verse 11, Hiram the king of Tyre, or Huram as Chronicles calls him, answered in writing, which he sent to Solomon, because the Lord loveth his people, he hath made thee king over them. Huram said, moreover, blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, that made heaven and earth, who hath given to David the king a wise son, endued with discretion and understanding, that should build an house for the Lord and an house for his kingdom. Now, pause there and think about the implication of that. Hiram is acknowledging the God of Israel. Now, does he also worship idols? I don't know. But his policy at this point is very friendly, very, very favorable to the God of Israel. But go on at verse 13. Now I have sent a cunning man endued with understanding of Huram my father's, the son of a woman of the daughters of Dan, and his father was a man of Tyre, skillful to work in gold, silver, brass, iron, stone, and timber, purple, blue, fine linen, in crimson, also to grave any manner of graving and devise any device, that there may be a place appointed unto him with thy cunning men and with the cunning men of my lord David thy father. So Solomon contracted with Hiram for materials, for skilled workmen, and Hiram throws this guy in basically as part of the deal. How is it that Israel seemingly is lacking in skilled craftsmen for this project, that Solomon has to go outside of Israel for this particular, not just for materials, but for skill to build the building? Have you ever wondered about that? And notice the things that Hiram mentions about this man's ability. He's not just a talented stone cutter and carpenter and framer and so forth. He's a metal worker. And what else can he do? He's an engraver as well. If you go back to Exodus chapter 20 and you look at the 10 commandments, or you look at Deuteronomy beginning in chapter 5 at Moses' reiteration of that, what's one of the fundamental instructions given to Israel? You don't make engraved images. Now, the interesting interpretation of that among the ancient Jews, the ancient Hebrews, was basically, you don't even practice that trade. We have no use for that trade. Now, they did coin and mint money and so forth, but even that, you look at the money of that era, and basically, like pretty much all money of that era, it's pretty crude compared to what we have. It was basically molded money, not stamped. But among the conservatives, shall we say, of the priests and the Levites, there sprang up this idea that we not only don't make graven images, carved images for worship, we don't carve, or in later years, they would even go so far as to say, we don't paint and draw images of plants or animals for any reason, because we don't want to even tiptoe along the edge of something that might be interpreted as a graven image. In fact, in much later years, post-Christian years, post-first century years, some of the rabbis would go so far as to say it's wrong even for a Jew to be an actor because he is portraying an image that is not himself. They don't have this particular skill set in abundance in Israel because of their understanding, it seems, that they needed to avoid this. If you think about it, most of the artwork, shall we say, or the architectural embellishments of that era are geometric patterns, lattice works and things like that. They're not typically things out of the natural world. But here, Hiram sends him a man with that skill set, and we're going to see that in the temple there are some of those things, and they are not graven images for idolatry. So the whole notion that it's wrong to even paint or draw, much less engrave things out of the natural world because that's just automatically idolatry. No, it's not, because those things were in the temple itself. And it's also interesting to notice a little bit about the lineage of this particular individual. His father was a Tyrian, but where was his mother from? This man's mother was a Danite. So he's got some background in Israel. His father was a man of Tyre. His mother was a woman of the daughters of Dan. Down here in 2 Chronicles chapter 2, verse 14 or 15, thereabouts. So Solomon raises a levy of laborers to serve and to provide for the needs and transport things in Israel proper. They're not slaves, they're draftees basically. There were slaves who worked in the quarries in Israel. If you flip over to chapter 9 in 1 Kings and look at verses 20 and 21, down here, all the people who were left of the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, who were not of the people of Israel, their descendants who were left after them in the land that the people of Israel were unable to devote to destruction, these Solomon drafted to be slaves, and they worked in his quarries. So he did practice slave labor in some circumstances, but not of his own people. Now, as we're going through chapter 5, you get down to verses 17 and 18, you have the completion of the gathering up of all the materials here. Everything is basically ready. They quarried out great costly stones to lay the foundation with dressed stones, and Solomon's builders and Hiram's builders, the men of Gibel, they did the cutting, they prepared the timber, they got everything ready off-site. And then the temple, when they assemble it, is basically a prefab building. Just put the pieces, it's a giant 3D jigsaw puzzle, put the pieces in place so that there's no racket, no sound of construction there. It's just the men putting the pieces in place. And so chapter 6 gives us the record of the construction, the outside of the temple in verses 1 through 10, and then the inner parts of it starting at verse 11, and the conditions that God attaches to it. Notice the description here. This is the 418th year after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, the 4th year of Solomon's reign. So he's accomplished a lot in a short time so far. Consolidated his hold on the kingdom, put down Adonijah, had peace, become famous for his wisdom already, and now he's begun building the temple. This year seems to correspond to about the year 966 BC, roughly speaking. If you flip over and look at 2 Chronicles chapter 3, at the beginning of the chapter here, in verses 1 and 2, Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to David his father, at the place that David had appointed on the threshing floor of Ornan, or Araunah, as he's described in 2 Samuel, the Jebusite. He began to build in the 2nd month of the 4th year. And then we have the measurements, the dimensions. How big was the tabernacle? Anybody recall? It was a big tent. If memory serves me, its dimensions were approximately, the tent itself were approximately half the size of this building. This building is 90 cubits long, 30 cubits wide, 45 cubits high. How long is a cubit? Generally speaking, it's accepted to be about 18 inches. It's measured as the distance from the crook of the elbow to the tip of the middle finger, which for an average guy is about 18 inches. Now, there are some circumstances in archaeological history of a royal cubit, which generally measures out about 21 inches. But for ease of multiplying things out, this building is, roughly speaking, about 140 feet, 135 feet long. It's about 50 feet, 45 feet wide, and it's about 4.5 stories tall, 5 stories tall. It's a big structure. So you add the porch to it, the entryway on the front, it's 105 long. So the details, it has windows with beveled frames, lattice work, and so forth. The windows, we're not talking about opening panes of glass. We're talking about ventilation, air circulation, covering lattice work to protect the inside. They're not movable windows. They're just for air exchange, basically. And no hammers, no chisels, no iron tools used on the construction site. These were all used in the quarries. Everything was built to measure beforehand. Now, come down to verse 9 here in chapter 6. He built the house, finished it, made the ceiling of the house of beams and planks of cedar, built the structure against the whole house 5 cubits high, joined to the house with timbers of cedar. And the word of the Lord came to Solomon concerning this house that you're building. How many times does God say to his people, if I'll bless you every way till Sunday and back again, or maybe in Solomon's case, it's every way till the Sabbath and back again. If you walk in my statutes, obey my rules, keep my commandments, I'll establish my word. I'll dwell among the people of Israel. Well, who does that put in control of this? That puts Solomon and his people in control. Now think about our relationship with the Lord. How is our relationship with him any different? If we walk with him, keep his statutes, obey his ordinances, what do we have in exchange? In this life, if we have to sacrifice houses and mothers and lands and family and so forth, what does God give us in exchange? In this life, everything, family, mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, houses, lands, provisions, and eternal life. If it's all up to us. It's all up to us. Now you pick up at verse 14 and 14 down through the end of the chapter. At verse 36, you have the details of the inside of the temple. The holy place and the most holy place are overlaid with gold and with carvings and with fine craftsmanship. You look at verses 23 through 28, notice what's in the most holy place. Carvings or engravings of cherubim, and their wings touched each other. And the second set of wings touched the walls. They literally fill the room. This would be profoundly impressive. Who gets to see it? The high priest gets to see it. They would know what's in there because it's recorded. The high priest actually gets to see it. Look down at verses 29 through 35 here in chapter 6. Around the walls of the house, he carved engraved figures of cherubim and palm trees and open flowers in the inner and outer rooms. The floor he overlaid with gold. The entrance to the inner sanctuary made doors of olive wood and covered the two doors with carvings of cherubim and palm trees and open flowers overlaid with gold and so forth. And we go through all of this, the whole notion of all engraving being idolatry, it doesn't work as far as the temple is concerned, does it? Now you get down and look at the end of chapter 6, verses 37 and 38, the duration of time to build the temple. The 4th year the foundation was laid, 4th year of Solomon's reign. And in the 11th year, in the month of Bull, which is the 8th month. Now they started in the 2nd month of the year. They end in the 8th month of the year, 11 years later, or rather 7 years later. So it takes 7.5 years, or parts of 7 years, to build the temple. It's going to take about 6 more years for him to finish the palace, but it's a much bigger structure. It takes a lot longer to build a bigger building. Chapter 7 is the building of Solomon's palace. Okay, go ahead, Mike.
This isn't the same thing, I guess, but out of curiosity, why were there no tools on site? Have you heard it? I know we can't go to scripture.
It's speculation as to why that was all prefabbed so that there'd be no sound. But if you think about it, when you're cutting and preparing material, what potential is there? There's potential for injury and potential for mistake. There's an old adage that goes with builders: measure twice and cut once. How many of us have ever mismeasured and cut? And what sort of thought goes through your head when you realize that? What response do you, as a Christian, a servant of the Most High, maybe have to throttle before it gets past your teeth when that hammer hits your thumb? We don't want those things on the site of the temple of God, do we? No mistakes, no errors, no injuries, nothing that would profane it or defile it in any way. Now, does the scripture say that's why? No. That's nothing but speculation. That's the only basic explanation I've ever heard offered for the why.
I imagine the rough quality would be the reason why. Well, I guess one of the main reasons why, but it's easy to assess it and do work and trade.
Well, there is that as well. Just on a purely practical level, if you prepare everything off-site, everything that goes to build the temple has to go what direction to get there? Up.
Oh,
Every stone, every timber, every connecting piece, everything associated with the temple has to go uphill. On a purely practical level, a stone that you have cut and trimmed weighs a lot less than a raw stone, doesn't it? A log that you have peeled down and shaped into a square beam weighs a whole lot less than the raw log, especially if you let it dry first. Dry wood typically weighs half what wet green wood does. And once it's dry, then it doesn't warp and twist and shrink like it will while it's still green. So everything that goes up the hill to Jerusalem is ready to use when it gets there. There is a practical aspect to this. It's less work, less waste. There's not a bunch of debris cluttering up the site. There's much less potential for any kind of injury or something that might. I mean, what happens if you're building stuff on site and cutting stone on site? What happens if somebody has a big piece of rock fall on him and gets killed? He's defiled. A body defiles whatever it touches. I can't use that stone. Now they've got to cart it back down away. So there are a whole host of possible explanations for why. Which one is the correct one? I don't know. Maybe none of them are. But those are the potential explanations that I've encountered through the years. If you've got others, or if you know somebody that's got others, that would.
Well, just the fact that it's a sacred spot,
Mhm.
does that have anything to do with it?
It might well, the fact that this is going to be a sacred place. This is where God appeared to David. This is the region, this is the area where Abraham had offered Isaac. You know, this place has a history, and it's not a construction yard. It has significance. Well, Solomon now, chapter 7, is going to build a palace and continue to consolidate his wealth and power and influence and so forth. As we go along, you have the parallel over here in 2 Chronicles, chapter 3, where he's building the temple, and chapter 4, it goes into details there. But now, as he builds his palace, it takes 13 years. And notice at verses 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 in chapter 7, he built the house of the forest of Lebanon. Its length was 100 cubits, its breadth 50 cubits, its height 30 cubits, built on 4 rows of cedar pillars with cedar beams on the pillars, covered with cedar above the chambers that were on the 45 pillars, 15 in each row, windows in 3 frames, windows opposite window in 3 tiers, and all the doorways and windows had square frames, and window was opposite window in 3 tiers. So it was all symmetrical. He made the hall of pillars, 50 cubits long, 30 cubits wide, a porch in front, and a canopy in front of them, and so forth. And it goes into detail here. Now, this house of the forest of Lebanon, this is going, you get down to chapter 10 and verse 17. This is kind of the main meeting hall where the hall for arms to be stored and shields and so forth will be put there, among other things. This is kind of the main impressive meeting place in the palace. And the other buildings are built on a comparable scale in terms of quality and furnishings and symmetry and so forth. Jump down to verse 8 and notice here, his own house where he was to dwell in the other court back of the hall was of like workmanship. Solomon also made a house like this hall for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he'd taken in marriage. She seems to be special. She's not the mother of Rehoboam, at least not as far as we can tell. He's going to have plenty of other companionship. He's going to have a harem like nobody's business. But this woman seems to stand out among all the others. Is it possible that this was a love match in addition to a commercial and political arrangement? Maybe, I don't know. But it says a lot about her, that he went to tremendous expense and tremendous recognition for her. And that's not said about any of the other wives.
We're never given her name, are we?
Not that I'm aware of. We're never given her name. Don't know what her name was. You could, I'm sure you could go back into some archaeological digging and probably find a possible name associated with this woman, but even that would be speculative. So costly materials, expensive materials are used, verses 9 through 12. And then we come back over in the rest of this chapter to the temple and talk about the furnishings of the temple. Sent and brought Hiram from Tyre. Hiram was the son of a widow of the tribe of Naphtali. Now, this is not King Hiram. This is a workman. Son of a widow from the tribe of Naphtali, father, a man of Tyre, a worker in bronze. So you've got another workman here. And he cast 2 pillars of bronze, 18 cubits high, 12 cubits in its circumference, hollow. Its thickness was 4 fingers. So it's about 4 inches thick, big structure, big pillar. And the second pillar was the same, made capitals or caps for them. I think the King James says chapiters, which is the crowning stone or cap on it. And the 2 pillars are named Yakin, which means he shall establish, and Boaz, which means in him is strength. And Boaz is significant because of what? Well, that's Solomon's great granddad. That's the man who was willing to redeem Ruth. That's the man who was willing to sacrifice his inheritance in order to obtain not just the inheritance of Naomi's late husband and sons, but Ruth specifically. There is a likeness there, a comparison there that we can make between him and God, willing to sacrifice in order to obtain us, his people. So we go on, we have details of the rest of the furnishings, the sea of cast bronze, the molten sea, as it's called in some translations, a big basin for water. You look over at 2 Chronicles in chapter 4, you have the description in verses 11 through 18 here. It says that he made it picks up at verse 14, he made the stands and the basins on the stands, the 1 sea and 12 oxen underneath it, the pots, shovels, forks, equipment for these, and so on. It's a large container. And if you think about it, they need a large storage facility for water in the temple. Now, in the days of Hezekiah, on down the road a couple of hundred years, what's Hezekiah going to do? Hezekiah is actually going to have his workmen dig an aqueduct from I believe it's the Gihon spring, if memory serves me, that will draw water into the city right in the vicinity of the temple. And that aqueduct, that tunnel, by the way, is still there, and you can walk through it today. You have to stoop down to get through part of it. It's quite small in some spots, but it carries hundreds of gallons of water a minute when needed. And that provided a constant supply of fresh water, primarily for the use of the temple. But that's on down the road. In the meantime, they have to have a lot of storage capacity for water because they need water for washing the sacrifices. They need water for washing the priests. They need water, they need water, they need water. They have water for purification and so forth. So you have this large basin provided here for washing the sacrifices. You have the other vessels of the temple down here from verses 40 to 51 in chapter 7. You pick up the pillars and the bowls of the capitals and the lattice works and so forth. All of these things, I'm not going to go into the details of them just for time's sake, but all of this goes to providing everything that would be needed for worship, so that worship, offerings, sacrifices would not be interrupted or have to come to a halt while we run get more water or run get more wood for the fire or what have you. All of this was to ensure that things would go smoothly and steadily, basically. Now, you have a comparison to this in 2 Chronicles chapters 4 and 5. And as we get farther in, then 2 Chronicles is going to give us more detail when it comes right down to the dedication of the temple. But we're not quite there yet. You have the placing of the Ark of the Covenant in the most holy place in chapter 8. Pick up at chapter 8, verses 1 through 12. Now we're ready to get the temple ready to use. All of this goes with preparing. Verses 1 through 12. Solomon assembles the elders, all the heads of the tribes. Everything that is needed is brought to the temple, including the tent of meeting. And what this, you get down here to verse 5, and King Solomon, all the congregation of Israel who had assembled before him, were with him before the ark, sacrificing so many sheep and oxen they could not be counted or numbered. Now that's a little inspired hyperbole. Yes, they could be, but they weren't. There was no limit to what Solomon was willing to sacrifice. And they are before the ark. That is, they're putting it in front of the temple for the sacrifices. The ark is about to be set into the temple structure in verses 6, 7, and 8. But notice the poles that are used to carry it at this point are so long that they protrude back into the holy place. You've got two sections to the temple structure itself. And what did I do with my marker? Oh, well. Oh, there it is, right in front of me. Been a bug, it would have been. The temple structure itself is 3 times as long as it is wide. It's divided into 2 parts. You've got the holy place, and then you've got the most holy, or the holy of holies. And the holy of holies, where the Ark of the Covenant is going to reside, is basically a cube in measurement. It's 1/3 of the structure. They're going to put the Ark of the Covenant in there, and the poles that they use to carry it are going to stick out into the most holy place, into the holy place rather, into the outer part of the structure. Now, flip back to Exodus chapter 25 for just a moment, and notice something interesting there. In Exodus chapter 25, as Moses is giving instructions, God is giving instructions to Moses that he will then pass on to the people. In Exodus chapter 25, you pick up at verse 23, you shall make a table of acacia wood, 2 cubits shall be its length, the cubit its breadth, the cubit and a half its height, overlay it with pure gold, make a molding of gold around it, make a rim around it, a handbreadth wide, and a molding of gold around the rim. And you shall make for it 4 rings of gold, fasten the rings to the 4 corners at its legs, close the frame, close to the frame. The rings shall lie as holders for the poles to carry the table. And as we go on then, we find that these things are a part of the furnishings being moved into the tabernacle, from the tabernacle to the temple. But back up, as we talk about the Ark of the Covenant earlier in chapter 25, at verse 14, you put poles into the rings of the sides of the ark to carry the ark by them. The poles shall remain in the rings of the ark. They shall not be taken from it. They're not to be removed. We would think, okay, you've got it in place, take the poles out. The poles don't come out. The poles stay in place. It's that way by law. That's why they're allowed to extend. At this point, according to 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 9, the only thing in the ark, in the box, are the tables of stone. There's no mention of Aaron's rod that budded. There's no mention of the pot of manna. What's happened to the rod? What's happened to the pot of manna? I don't know. I don't know. The only thing that's mentioned here are the tablets of stone with the 10 commandments. So you pick up at verse 10. Now, what does the Lord do? Now the Lord is going to enter the place. The priests came out of the holy place. A cloud filled the house of the Lord so that the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord. The parallel over here in 2 Chronicles is actually going to give us more detail in some respects. If you flip over to 2 Chronicles chapter 6, now you get into Solomon's prayer of dedication at this point. It begins at verse 12, and this is where Solomon is basically leading the people. Now, the high priest is the chief officiant in all things religious, but Solomon is the chief officiant, shall we say, in terms of the relationship between the nation and God. Because who is Solomon? He's the king, but as king, in a sense, he is Israel. He is the embodiment of Israel in a sense. And so as he speaks, he is committing the nation on a level, in a way that even the high priest can't, to their commitment to God. This is what we're doing. So in this offering, the Lord enters, the priests have left the holy place, and now we have Solomon's speech. And I just dropped my marker. We have Solomon's speech and Solomon's prayer of dedication. And the prayer of dedication of Solomon, especially as it's recorded over in 2 Chronicles chapter 6, it's a rhetorical masterpiece. Solomon sees the cloud's presence as an indication that God has accepted the temple and will dwell in it. You flip back over to Leviticus chapter 16 and verse 2, and there you have reference in anticipation of this. In Leviticus chapter 16, the Lord spoke to Moses after the death of the two sons of Aaron when they drew near before the Lord and died. That would be Nadab and Abihu. And the Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron your brother not to come at any time into the holy place inside the veil before the mercy seat that is on the ark, so that he may not die. For I will appear in the cloud over the mercy seat. Well, guess what he just did? He just appeared in the cloud over the mercy seat. You have a fulfillment of prophecy here in this act by God. And so now Solomon begins to appeal to God. Bless the nation. Jerusalem was God's choice. It was not made known back in 2 Samuel chapter 7, 2 Chronicles chapter 6. You look at verses 5 and 6 there over in 2 Chronicles. And God says, I chose no city out of all the tribes of Israel in which to build a house that my name might be there. I chose no man as prince over my people Israel. He's talking about in the days of Joshua, Moses, Joshua, Judges, and so forth. But I have chosen Jerusalem that my name may be there. I have chosen David to be over my people Israel. Up to this point, he's not made his choice known in this circumstance. Now Solomon acknowledges that and declares he's completed everything. And notice down here at verses 17 through 21 in 1 Kings chapter 8, everything I have done is according to whose will? Chapter 17, chapter 8, 1 Kings chapter 8, pick up at verse 17. He says here, now it was in the heart of David my father to build a house for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. But the Lord said to David my father, whereas it was in your heart to build a house for my name, you did well that it was in your heart. Nevertheless, you shall not build the house, but your son, who shall be born to you, shall build the house for my name. Now, here's Solomon's statement, verse 26, or verse 20 rather. Now the Lord has fulfilled his promise that he made. For I have risen in the place of David my father and sit on the throne of Israel, as the Lord promised, and I have built the house for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. And there I have provided a place for the ark, in which is the covenant of the Lord that he made with our fathers when he brought them out of the land of Egypt. Now, Solomon declares that everything he has done is according to the will of the Lord. He recognizes what I have accomplished is the fulfillment of God's prophecy through David. If what I do is the fulfillment of God's will, who gets credit? God deserves the credit. And in this dedication process, the outstanding characteristic of Solomon is that while he acknowledges his participation over and over and over again, he credits God with making it possible. He never, in this prayer of dedication or in anything associated with it, he never says, look what I have done. It's always what I have done according to the will of God, what I have done by the power of God, what I have done according to the word of God. There's always this recognition that this is of God, not of me. After all, it wasn't Solomon's idea, was it? It was David's idea in a way, but even that seems to have been according to the will of God. Now you have the prayer of dedication that picks up at chapter 6 at verse 12 and goes down basically to the end of the chapter to verse 39. You have the parallel over in 2 Chronicles, and you have some detail there. But Solomon is, at this point, he's on a raised scaffolding. He's up above the crowd, above the people. He is on his knees on that scaffolding and seems to have his hands outstretched. You look down to verse 54 in the chapter in reference to that. Over in 2 Chronicles chapter 6, notice at verse 12, if you will, Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in the presence of all the assembly of Israel and spread out his hands. Well, he stood on his knees, apparently.
I'm lost. Which verse says that he was on his knees?
Go back to 1 Kings chapter 8, and you pick up at verse 22. Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in the presence of all the assembly of Israel, spread out his hands toward heaven, and said, O Lord God of Israel, there's no God like you in heaven above or on earth beneath, keeping covenant, showing steadfast love to your servants who walk before you with all their heart. And as we go along here, I've lost it.
54 and 5.
Thank you.
He rose from.
Chronicles
Yes,
13,
Yeah.
Yes. 1 Kings 8, verse 54, he had knelt and now he gets up, and 2 Chronicles 8, 6 and verse 13.
He knelt on his knees
Yeah. So
and put his hands up.
notice the things that he says, though, in the course of this prayer of dedication. No other God can keep promises like you. Please continue to keep your promises. We know that you're everywhere. Down here at verse 33, your eyes are everywhere. There's nowhere that you're not. Over in Isaiah chapter 66 and verse 1, Isaiah echoes that same thought. He makes a request in verses 28 through 30. Please continue to hear our prayers. That's an interesting request. Is God obligated to entertain our prayers? That would be a question worth giving some thought and some study to.
He's not obligated, but he did ask us to pray without ceasing.
God's obligation is what he has put on himself. We cannot obligate him in that respect. Please judge righteously. Verses 31 and 32. That's an interesting thought down here in chapter 8. You look at verses 31 and 32. If a man sins against his neighbors, made to take an oath, comes and swears his oath before your altar in this house, then hear in heaven and act and judge your servants, condemning the guilty by bringing his conduct on his own head, vindicating the righteous by rewarding him according to his righteousness. When we look at the character of God, when has he ever not acted and judged righteously? He never has been anything but perfectly righteous. But as Solomon expresses this request, this desire, where does the focus seem to be? On what the people are going to see. And what is one of the primary objections people raise where God is concerned? Well, why do the wicked prosper? Doesn't do any good to serve God. Come down to the time of the latter prophets in the days of Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel and Habakkuk and these guys just leading up to the Babylonian captivity. And what are some of the more affluent, faithless Jews saying by way of excusing their ungodly behavior? It doesn't do any good to serve God. God blesses the folks that take care of themselves. Why should we bother to serve God? I'm too busy getting ahead. How many people in the world today, and how many Christians even, fall into that trap? But Solomon's prayer is, Lord, make this visible, that it pays, there's a blessing to serving you, to being faithful to you. And then he goes on, other requests. Let our repentance, when we have sinned and we repent, let our repentance be accepted. Give us victory over our enemies. When we sin and we repent, accept our repentance and remove the drought that comes as a result of our, there's recognition here of retribution from God for misbehavior. When do Israel's enemies prosper? When Israel sins. When does Israel suffer drought? When Israel sins. Look at verses 37 and 38. Request for repentance to be accepted and punishment to be removed. If there's a famine in the land, if there's pestilence or blight or mildew or locust or caterpillars, if their enemy besieges them in the land at their gates, whatever plague or sickness there is, whatever prayer, whatever plea is made by any man or by all your people Israel, each knowing the affliction of his own heart and stretching out his hands toward heaven, then hear in heaven your dwelling place, and forgive and act and render to each whose heart you know, according to all his ways. And notice what he says here, for you only know the hearts of all the children of mankind, that they may fear you all the days that they live in the land that you gave to our fathers. So there's a constant repetition, a constant recognition that they need to fear, they need to reverence the Lord. Verses 41, 42, 43, here's an interesting aspect to this, and one that a lot of later Jews probably would like to have just overlooked and ignored in their biases and prejudices. When a Gentile, a foreigner who is not of your people Israel, lives in the land, hear him when he worships you. Accept his worship. 44 through 50, if captivity comes, boy, there's a prophetic thought, isn't there? If captivity comes, verse 48, then accept our repentance and restore us. Now, why would captivity ever come? Sin. And what had Moses told them and Joshua told them, the prophets and the judges, now even Solomon, by implication, told them, you misbehave. You misbehave bad enough, God will spit you out of this land into captivity, just like he did the people that were before you, for the same reason. Well, why? Look down here at verses 51 to 53 in chapter 8 of 1 Kings. Starting at verse 51, they are your people, your heritage, which you brought out of Egypt from the midst of the iron furnace. Well, there's a figure of speech, a metaphor to describe that bondage and servitude in Egypt, an iron furnace. Let your eyes be open to the plea of your servant and to the plea of your people Israel, giving ear to them whenever they call to you. For you separated them from among all the peoples of the earth to be your heritage, as you declared through Moses, your servant, when you brought our fathers out of Egypt, O Lord God. Now think about this a minute. You separated them. What in the New Testament echoes that thought? Think about 1 Peter chapter 2.
Come out from among them.
Well, there's 1 Peter chapter 1, come out from among them, be separate, touch no unclean thing, but what about 1 Peter 2? Yeah, that's right. You are a chosen generation, a holy people, a people for God's own, a separated people for God's own possession, God's special treasure.
Also made me think of Jesus's prayer in John 17.
Yeah,
In the world, but not of the world.
there you go. The garden prayer in John 17. They're in the world, but they're not of the world. We are God's inheritance, just as they were. And it's ultimately, it's to God's glory to accept true repentance from his people. God punishes sin. His character, his nature, his righteousness demand that the penalty of sin be paid. But God delights in mercy. And so he extends mercy to his people, not ignoring their sin. But what has he ultimately done for us? He's paid the price for us so that he can love us and accept us through the blood of Christ. Now, you come to the conclusion of the prayer itself down here in verses 40 through 42. This is the actual conclusion of the prayer. They shall hear of your great name, your mighty hand, your outstretched arm, when a foreigner comes and prays, and so forth. Now, from verse 54 down to the end of the chapter, this is actually a benediction. It's the close of the prayer in a sense, but it's a blessing on the congregation. It's Solomon asking God's blessing, asking God's goodness for them. As Solomon finished offering all this prayer, a plea to the Lord, he arose from the altar where he had knelt with hands outstretched toward heaven, stood and blessed all the assembly. And notice at verse 56 what he says to the people here. Blessed be the Lord, who has given rest to his people Israel, according to all that he promised. Not one word has failed. Seems like I read that somewhere before. Joshua 23. Not one word has failed of all his good promise, which he spoke by Moses, his servant. The Lord our God be with us as he was with our fathers. May he not leave us or forsake us. Incline our hearts to him to walk in all his ways and keep his commandments, statutes, and rules which he commanded our fathers. He's speaking now not to God, but to the people. Let these words stick with you. That statement, though, in verse 56, not one word. That's grabbing this millennial idea and slapping it in the face and saying there's nothing to this, you're wrong. But that's the substance of most modern Protestant theology. Go back 45 years in American history. This is 2022. So go back to Jimmy Carter years. And what is one of President Carter's proudest achievements as president?
Israel.
Camp David peace accords. Menachem Begin on one side, and it's Yasser Arafat on the other side, and they're all shaking hands with each other. Why was he so focused on getting that agreement? It wasn't just humanitarian concerns for the Palestinians and worry about another 6-day war like they'd had in 1972.
This is religion.
His theology says Jesus has to come and reign in Jerusalem. His theology says there has to be worldwide peace on earth. His theology says that God has not fulfilled his promise yet. And he's a good man in many ways. But he's dead wrong about that. Because Solomon and Joshua before him say that God kept his promise. Not one word failed. Now, I know our time is quickly getting away. We've just got a couple of minutes. Flip over to 2 Chronicles chapter 7 and just notice there for a moment as they offer sacrifices for the dedication. The last words, Lord, do not turn away the face of your anointed one. Remember your steadfast love for David, your servant. As soon as Solomon finished his prayer, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. Well, what all is going to end up being sacrificed here? The numbers are staggering. Now, clearly, all of this can't be sacrificed in one moment. The ongoing sacrifices last for days. 22,000 oxen, 120,000 sheep. Can you imagine how much water, how many thousands of gallons of water it took to wash all the sacrifices? Can you imagine how many thousands of gallons of blood had to be sprinkled and disposed of and so forth? How much wood it took to burn all of this and divide it out? How many priests spent days slaughtering animals for all of this? The numbers here are not, there's nothing, no reason for us to believe that this is any kind of exaggeration. Solomon, before he's done, will arguably be the only trillionaire in all of human history. His wealth, even by modern standards, is staggering to imagine. Makes Donald Trump and Bill Gates and guys like that just look like pikers by comparison. The idea that he couldn't possibly have gathered all this together has no basis in fact. All of Israel is involved in the celebration, the dedication, not just the princes of Israel. It takes a week. The celebration part of it is over on the 8th day after the second seven-day feast. So this takes days to get this all accomplished. 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verses 4 through 10 has the record of all of this. The priests stood at their posts, the Levites with the instruments of music that David had made and so forth. And Solomon consecrated the middle of the court that was before the house of the Lord, for there he offered the burnt offering and the fat of the peace offerings. He didn't do it himself, the priests did, obviously, but he's the one bringing the offerings. And this is just the whole of this process is staggering to our imaginations. Now, the rest of chapter 8 is the record of Solomon's prayer at this point, at the conclusion of the process, basically. And this is the passage that you often see excerpts of it extracted and printed on bumper stickers and window placards and whatnot, lifted out of its context, really. If my people who are called by my name humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear them from heaven and forgive their sin and heal their land. Well, it's a true principle even today. God acknowledges those who honor him. I'm afraid, though, that in modern application, a whole lot of people seem to think that America is the United States specifically, as Canadians and Mexicans will tell you, and all South Americans, where everybody that lives here is an American. But I think sometimes we take that passage and put it into a context that says the United States is God's people, and we're no more God's people than the English, the Irish, the Dutch, or the Afghanis in that respect. Our time is up. We got the temple built and dedicated. We'll move on from here. Comments or thoughts or questions, and we'll try to expand some of this out a little bit as we go along.
Why the quantities? Why that many?
Why the extravagant quantities? All I can do is speculate, but if you think about it, if you have $10,000 at your disposal and you give the Lord $10, what does that say about you? That kind of implies that you're cheap, doesn't it? That would be our understanding of that scenario. If you have $10,000 and you give $1,000, that's pretty impressive. That's 10%. But guess what? In general terms, that's what we understand that the ancient Hebrews were obligated to. Now, even that's kind of a misnomer and a misunderstanding, because if you tally up not just the temple tax and the basic percentages and so forth, but also the free will offerings and sin offerings and the drink offerings and the wave offerings and the peace offerings and everything else, an observant Hebrew might easily actually devote somewhere between 30 and 50% of gross income to the Lord at times. And how many of us could willingly do that? You know, when it comes down to a vacation to Disney World, or just stay home and have enough to pay the rent so that we can give that to the work of the kingdom, how many of us are willing to explain to the kids, this is really more important? Mind you, I'm not saying it's wrong to go to Disney World. Been there, done that, didn't get a t-shirt. Didn't want one. But when you have extraordinary abundance, like Solomon did, you have the ability to demonstrate extraordinary generosity, extraordinary dedication, commitment. Solomon, in his tremendous offerings, in one sense, is setting a standard for the people, setting an example. How often do we think about the example that we set, even if it's just for a spouse or for our children, in what we offer to the Lord? And I'm not now just talking about what you put in the offering plate or give online, or however the congregation's doing it at the moment. What about your time? What about your participation in the work of the kingdom? Go ahead, Brother Rick.
Yeah, what I see in that is a small example of Christ's atoning sacrifice for us. All that big extravagant display is really showing God's love and his mercy and all the blood that's being shed. It kind of illustrates to me what God has to do to atone for man's sin.
Okay, Rick's comment for those of you online is that in one sense, what you have here is a sort of a visual prequel, if you will, of the sacrifice God would make for us, pouring out his son's blood in place of ours. And, you know, if Solomon would pour out the blood of all of these extraordinary volume of sacrifices just as an offering to God, how much more is God giving us in pouring out the blood of his son? Good point. Ms. Cherie?
Yeah, and then also we have to, King Solomon, it's like when he asked, when God said, you know, ask what you will. He didn't ask for money.
That's right.
And so most of us would think, ooh, all this money, all this Solomon's sacrificing, that wasn't, you know, that wasn't his thing. He didn't even look at it.
Well,
like
that's true. He didn't, when God offered him his heart's desire, he didn't ask for all of this. So it speaks well of him that he's not trying to hold on to it.
Solomon had so much, he had so much, that for it to even be a sacrifice would take an awful lot.
Well, that's a point well taken
His
too.
father said, I will not sacrifice to God that which costs me.
Right.
That's right.
To the line
David-
costs Solomon something.
That's a point well taken. David had at this same site said, I will not offer what costs me nothing. And he bought the threshing floor and the oxen and everything to stay the plague. And when you have as much as Solomon has, you got to give a lot just for it to not cost you nothing. You have to give a lot in order to feel it, so to speak.
I just think, I mean, it's because, I like that, but I think because it's Jehovah, right? I'm gonna give him everything. What was required of me was to give this one sacrifice and these two things here, but because it's Jehovah, I'm gonna give everything I've got. Now, I think of the parallel that we see today of people wanting to give the minimum. What's the minimum I need to be a Christian? What's the minimum I need to slide in the door, to get there? What's the minimum?
Yeah.
And you see this example, like it's because it's Jehovah.
What will get me on the back row in heaven?
Yeah.
That's the attitude in today's world.
Just want to get in the door.
Yeah, just slide into the last thing.
And that attitude is no part of this kind of sacrifice.
And I'm just trying to think also, wrap my head around the dark. How was it cloud described? That came across the temple? Was it dark?
Mhm.
See, I read too many kids books because it's always like the pillar, the cloud is always white, this pillar, and that was interesting. I never really
Mhm.
thought that the cloud could be dark.
Blot out the sun.
Yeah, that was pretty cool.
Yeah.
And we connected.
The cloud that overtops the temple is dark, and it's not all sunshine and rainbows. It's intimidating. Put it that way.
Yeah, I guess too many kids books always show it, this big white cloud.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Other questions, other comments, folks online? All right, we'll stop here and call it class. Thank you for being here. God willing, see you next week.